The Duke found her waiting by the carriage, and knew at once he'd wait a lifetime for her return. The evening had descended upon Fenwick Manor like a benediction of amber light, casting long shadows across the gravel path that wound toward the turning circle where the travelling carriage stood sentinel. The horses shifted restlessly, their breath misting in the cooling air, as if even they sensed the weight of imminent departure. Alistair Fenwick, the Duke of Argentford, had not meant to witness this moment, had not in fact intended to return from his ride until the household had settled into its evening rituals. Yet something, some invisible thread pulled taut by fate itself, had drawn him down this particular path at precisely this hour. She stood motionless beside the carriage door, her gloved hands clasped before her in a gesture that spoke not of prayer, but of self-preservation. Her name was Mira Solene, though few in society knew that name carried the weight of secrets older than the title she bore. The evening breeze caught the edge of her travelling cloak, a dove-grey wool, practical and unadorned, and lifted it gently, as though the wind itself wished to draw her attention elsewhere, anywhere but toward the door that would carry her away. Alistair slowed his horse's gait, moving through the shadows of the elm-lined avenue with deliberate quietness. He was not by nature a man given to impulse or theatrical gesture. 4 decades of duty, of measured responses and calculated silences, had sculpted him into a figure of restrained authority. Yet, in this moment, watching the candlelight from the carriage lamps catch the darker honey tones of her hair, he felt something within his carefully constructed composure begin to fracture like ice beneath spring thaw. "I did not know you intended to depart this evening," he said, his voice calm but carrying that particular timbre of authority that caused even the horses to still. The words emerged not as an accusation, but as an observation of fact, and yet somehow they carried the weight of a question beneath their smooth surface. Mira turned, though not quickly. Her movement possessed the quality of one who had rehearsed the gesture in solitude many times before. Her eyes, deep amber beneath darker lashes, held that peculiar mixture of composure and concealed anguish that had drawn his notice months ago at a ball he had attended without interest, and left unable to forget. "Your Grace," she said, and her curtsy held the perfect degree of formality required by station and propriety. "I had hoped to depart unobserved, not from discourtesy toward your household, but from necessity." Alistair dismounted with practiced elegance, his boots striking the gravel with a sound that seemed to echo across the garden like a pronouncement. He held the reins loosely, allowing his horse to settle into patience beside them. "Necessity is not an explanation I often hear employed as justification for sudden flight in the darkness," he observed. His gaze travelled to the small leather case at her feet, and then to the object she held clasped in one trembling hand, a brass and glass ampule no larger than a woman's fist, suspended from a crimson ribbon. An hourglass, he realized, a travelling hourglass, the kind used to measure the hours of a journey. The sand within it had been inverted recently. Mere grains remained in the upper chamber. "Time grows short, I perceive," he said quietly. Mira's fingers tightened around the glass. "All things are brief, Your Grace, even those we wish might endure forever." There was something in the way she spoke, not with self-pity or melodrama, but with the resigned certainty of one who had made peace with a terrible truth, that caused Alistair to step closer, though caution held him from breaching the careful distance propriety demanded. "You are fleeing from something," he said, not a question. "I am fleeing toward a truth," she corrected, and her voice, though soft, held an unshakable firmness, one that cannot be found within these walls, one that requires distance, solitude, and records, kept far from this county. The ampule caught the lamplight as her hand moved, casting a small shadow that danced across her wrist. Alistair noticed she wore no rings, no jewels of any kind except for that singular measure of time held so desperately within her grip. "Then I shall not endeavor to stop you," he said, and meant it with a depth of conviction that surprised even his own disciplined heart. "But you shall not depart from this house into darkness without knowing that you are seen, understood, and held in regard, despite whatever it is you carry into the night." For the first time her composure wavered. Her eyes glistened with the promise of tears, though none fell. The discipline required to maintain that composure seemed to cost her everything. "You cannot know what you are saying, sir. You cannot comprehend the magnitude of what I carry, what I have concealed, or what must come to light." "Perhaps not," Alistair conceded, "but I know this. I shall not forget you waiting by this carriage as the world slides into darkness." nor shall I cease wondering if you return to tell me that the truth you sought illuminated your path homeward." The coach lanterns swayed gently, and Mira looked toward them as though they were the eyes of something living that awaited her decision. "If I do not depart now," she whispered, "I shall not find courage to depart at all, and if I stay, I shall become complicit in the very lie that has poisoned my family's name." Alistair nodded slowly. "Then you must go, but know that the door of this house shall remain unlocked to you, no matter how long the journey." The carriage door remained open, a dark aperture that seemed to devour light rather than admit it. The coachman sat rigid upon his high seat, reins gathered in his hands, awaiting only the signal to depart. He was a man Alistair recognized as loyal, one of the old staff who served without question and spoke to no one of the household's private arrangements. This recommended him highly for whatever journey Mira had arranged. "How long have you known?" Alistair asked, his eyes never leaving her face. "How long have you carried this knowledge in silence?" Mira moved toward the carriage steps with the deliberate care of one navigating not a physical journey, but an emotional precipice. "Since I was young enough to believe that others would correct the record if given opportunity," she said. "Since I was old enough to realize that silence is sometimes more profitable than truth. Since I was brave enough to understand that my duty to my own soul supersedes my duty to preserve a reputation built upon falsehood." She began to ascend the steps, one gloved hand gripping the rail with white-knuckled intensity. The ampule dangled from her other wrist, the remaining grains of sand catching the lamplight in tiny flecks of gold. "The documents await in Argentford," she continued, her voice steady now despite the tremor in her hands. "My Aunt Isolde, God bless her weary soul, kept records that our family wished destroyed, journals, letters, a will that contradicts everything we have been told regarding the succession and the legitimacy of—" She paused, biting her lower lip as though to prevent herself from utterance too complete. Alistair stepped forward, his hand extended in a gesture of support, though he remained aware of the proprieties that governed the distance between them. "You need not confess the entire catalogue of your family's transgressions to justify your departure," he said gently. "Your consciousness, which evidently is more finely tuned than those who raised you, shall be sufficient testimony." Mira grasped the side of the carriage as she lifted herself to the interior. The movement caused her travelling dress to catch briefly on the step, and Alistair reached to free it with careful fingers, touching only the fabric, maintaining the propriety that governed even this moment of farewell. "There is one thing more you must know," Mira said, turning to face him from the carriage threshold. Her face, framed by the rectangle of the doorway, seemed to glow with an almost ethereal quality, some mixture of lamplight and the inner illumination of one who has chosen courage over comfort. "The documents I seek will expose not merely family dishonor, but active deception regarding property, inheritance, and—" she drew breath, "and regarding my own birthright. If what Aunt Isolde hinted at in her final letters is true, I am not who I have believed myself to be. Or rather, I am someone whose claim to the name Solène is considerably more complicated than I have been permitted to understand." Thunder rumbled across distant hills, a warning that the weather pattern was shifting. The horses began to shift more noticeably, sensing the change in atmospheric pressure. "Regardless of the name you bear," Alistair said, and his voice carried an unexpected intensity that seemed to surprise them both, "your character remains unaltered by whatever facts history has concealed. You are the woman who has moved through society with quiet dignity, despite circumstances designed to diminish you. You are the woman whose integrity has been evident to those with eyes to perceive it. That shall not change, no matter what documents reveal." Mira's hand trembled as she raised it to her throat. "You are kind, Your Grace, unnecessarily so, but kindness will not protect me from the scandal that must inevitably follow revelation, nor will it restore the respectability of my family name once the truth becomes public." "Then perhaps," Alistair said, "your family name shall finally become worthy of the woman who bears it. From ashes, restoration; from silence, truth; from darkness, illumination." The coachman looked down from his perch, waiting. The horses pawed the earth with increasing restlessness. The wind had begun to carry with it the scent of coming rain, that green electric smell that precedes a storm. "I have brought provisions for a fortnight's travel," Mira said, speaking now with the practicality of one who has settled all emotional business and turns toward logistics. "I shall proceed first to the Kentish safe house, then onward to Argentford to access the family records room. The journey is not without risk, but the risk of remaining exceeds the danger of departure." Alistair inclined his head in acknowledgement. "You shall want for nothing that my household can provide. I shall instruct the steward to ensure that coin is made available at every way station. I shall provide a letter of introduction that will grant you the protection of several associates positioned along your route." "I cannot accept such patronage," Mira began, but her protest was immediate and unconvincing. They both knew that her resources were limited, that her family would certainly move to intercept her should her direction become known, and that the protection of the Duke's name, however quietly extended, was her single greatest assurance of safe passage. "You are accepting not patronage," Alistair said carefully, "but the ordinary courtesy extended by one member of the nobility to another, engaged in a matter of honor. I make no claim upon you, Miss Solène. I make only the simple assertion that truth deserves to be unveiled, and that integrity deserves protection." The coachman cleared his throat softly, an indication that departure must now be imminent. Mira took one final step into the carriage interior, settling herself upon the velvet bench with the ampule of sand clasped once more in her lap. She did not fasten her eyes upon Alistair, but rather gazed at the object that had become her talisman, that tiny measure of time, that portable hourglass that would mark the hours of her journey and remind her each time she inverted it that nothing remains static, that all transformation requires duration. "The documents I carry," she said, and her voice now possessed the clarity of finality, "will prove that the current succession of the Solène earldom is founded upon the concealment of an illegitimate birth. My father, it would appear, was not the legitimate heir. His claim rested upon the suppression of evidence, the removal of certain entries from the family records, and the silence of those who knew the truth." Alistair listened without interruption, his face a study in careful neutrality, though something in his eyes had shifted, some recognition of the magnitude of what she carried both within her knowledge and within her small leather case. "Furthermore," Mira continued, and her composure was extraordinary now that the final hour of revelation had approached, "there exists evidence that the property held under the Solène name for 3 generations was acquired through means that the law would characterize as fraudulent. If these facts become known, the title becomes questionable, the estates become forfeit, everything my family has built upon silence collapses into legal and social ruin. And you," Alistair said quietly, "will be the instrument of that collapse." "I will be the instrument of truth," Mira corrected, and there was no defiance in her tone, only a profound sadness. "Whether truth collapses reputation or restores honor depends upon the character of those who receive it." The coachman made a small sound indicating that departure could no longer be delayed. Alistair reached into his inner coat pocket and withdrew a sealed letter, the wax bearing his ducal crest, 3 stags rampant beneath a crown, rendered in deep red sealing wax that caught the lamplight with an almost liquid quality. "This letter," he said, extending it to her through the carriage window, "shall serve as your introduction to any of my associates along the southern route. It requests that they provide you with protection, discretion, and passage. No questions asked, no accounts rendered to me. Your business remains your own, but my name lends weight to your safety." Mira took the letter with visible reluctance, as though accepting it might somehow bind her to obligation. "I do not know how I shall repay such kindness, Your Grace. I do not know if I shall ever be in a position to offer reciprocal courtesy." "You misunderstand the nature of the gesture," Alistair said, and there was something in his voice now that had shifted, something that spoke not of duty or propriety, but of something far more personal, far more dangerous. "This letter is not an investment expecting return. It is a simple acknowledgement of one truth, that I have known you, however briefly, and in knowing you have been forever altered by the knowledge." Mira's eyes lifted to his then, and in them he saw his own mirror, the same wariness, the same hunger for understanding, the same profound loneliness of those who perceive truth before their time has come to speak it. "If I fail," she whispered, "if the documents do not exist as Aunt Isolde promised, or if they prove less significant than she believed, then you will have discovered an essential truth about yourself," Alistair said. "That you are braver than fear, that you are willing to sacrifice comfort for integrity, and that you possess the courage to walk into darkness, seeking light." The first drops of rain began to fall, large and widely spaced, striking the carriage roof with soft percussion. The coachman shifted the reins, and the horses stirred as though awakening from a long sleep. "One final question," Alistair said, and his voice had dropped so low that she had to lean forward to hear it above the gathering rain. When you have found your truth, when you have returned to the light, will you return here?" Mira was silent for so long that he feared she would not answer. The ampule turned slowly in her hands as the rain began to fall in earnest, drumming now upon roof and carriage door, a sound like 1,000 tiny fists demanding passage. "I do not know," she said finally. "The person who departed may not be the same person who returns. I may not be welcomed home. I may discover truths that remake me entirely. Then I ask only that you allow me this, the privilege of waiting, of remaining here in the knowledge that should you return, I shall be present to receive you, not as the woman you were, but as whoever you become." The carriage lurched forward slightly as the coachman gathered reins tighter. Mira's hand extended from the window, and for one infinite moment, Alistair caught her gloved fingers between his own. A touch that was barely a touch, a gesture that encompassed everything propriety forbidden them both. "If I return," she said, "it shall not be because duty demands it. It shall be because my heart has learned something in your absence that only your presence can confirm." The carriage rolled forward into the rain, and Alistair stepped backward, releasing her hand and watching as the vehicle became gradually obscured by sheets of grey precipitation and gathering darkness. She did not look back, and he stood motionless in the downpour, letting the rain soak through his coat, his boots, his carefully constructed indifference. The Duke of Argentford, for the first time in his disciplined and measured existence, understood what it meant to wait. Fortnight passed before Alistair received word. The letter arrived by private courier, sealed with unfamiliar wax, not the Solène crest, but something older, more austere. His hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal in the privacy of his study, the afternoon light slanting through tall windows, casting everything in that particular shade of amber that reminded him too vividly of her eyes. "Your Grace, I have reached Argentford and found the safe house precisely as described in Aunt Isolde's correspondence. The documents exist. They are far more extensive than I had dared hope, and far more damning than even my darkest imaginings permitted. I confess that upon first reading them, I found myself unable to rise from the floor where I had collapsed in recognition of the magnitude of what my family has concealed. The truth is this: my father was not the legitimate heir to the Solène earldom. The succession was engineered through the systematic removal of evidence and the calculated silence of witnesses. Moreover, the estates were acquired through means that constitute fraud upon the crown itself. The legal implications are staggering. The social implications are catastrophic. I have engaged a solicitor of impeccable reputation in Argentford, a man whose discretion is assured and whose expertise regarding matters of disputed succession is renowned. He has undertaken to prepare a petition to the Crown that will lay bare the entirety of this deception. The process, he informs me, shall require no fewer than 3 months, and the outcome remains uncertain. There exists a possibility that the Crown may choose to permit the fiction to persist, rather than endure the scandal of having been deceived by one of its oldest noble families. I find myself in a peculiar state of emotional suspension. I am neither entirely relieved nor entirely devastated. I am simply awaiting the solicitor's assessment, awaiting the Crown's response, awaiting perhaps the person I shall become once this burden is lifted from my shoulders. I think of you often in this exile. I think of your kindness extended in that final moment before departure. I think of your words regarding the person I might become. I wonder, with increasing frequency, whether that person would be someone you might recognize or wish to know. I shall write again when there is substance to report. For now, please know that your letter has proven invaluable. Your associates have extended every courtesy, and I have wanted for nothing material. It is only the uncertainty of the soul that leaves me perpetually unsettled. With sincere regard and gratitude, M.S. Alistair read the letter a dozen times, until he had nearly committed it to memory. He noted the careful formality, the deliberate distance maintained even in the act of confessing her emotional state. She did not ask him to wait. She did not promise her return. She offered only the bare acknowledgement that she thought of him, that she wondered if he might accept her transformed self. He wrote back immediately, his response measured and composed, extending what support a gentleman might offer to a woman engaged in a matter of honor. He did not permit his hand to betray the racing of his heart. He did not confess the manner in which her absence had begun to permeate every hour of his day. 3 weeks later, a second letter arrived. The news was grave. Solène Vaunt, the distant cousin who had long served as the family's primary legal advisor, had learned of her investigation. He had made inquiries regarding the documents, regarding the solicitor's involvement, regarding the precise nature of her claims. His inquiries had taken on an increasingly threatening tone. "He has sent a messenger bearing a message of extraordinary coldness," she wrote. "He suggests that should I persist in my foolish and destructive pursuit of these matters, consequences shall befall not merely my own reputation, but the welfare of those I hold dear. He has specifically named 3 servants who have remained with the family for decades, suggesting that their employment and security might be compromised should I prove recalcitrant. It is, I believe, what constitutes a threat masquerading as caution. It is the language of a man who has calculated that intimidation remains more effective than law. I confess that I am afraid, not of what may befall me. I have already sacrificed everything that constitutes my former life, but I fear for those innocents who have shown me kindness and might suffer for my integrity. I wonder if I am not merely exchanging one form of dishonor for another, trading family corruption for the destruction of those who have no part in that corruption." Alistair's response was swift and unambiguous. He took the liberty, he wrote, of dispatching his own legal counsel to Argentford. He had furthermore ensured that the 3 servants mentioned by name were immediately offered positions within his own household, should they wish to accept employment removed from the sphere of Vaunt's influence. He had also made certain discreet inquiries regarding Vaunt's own financial circumstances, and had discovered certain irregularities that might prove of interest to the Crown's financial auditors. "You are not alone in this matter," he wrote, his hand pressing pen to paper with unusual force. "You have my word as a gentleman, as a duke, and as a man who has come to regard your welfare as inseparable from his own honor. Whatever Vaunt threatens, he shall find arrayed against him resources and determination far exceeding his own capacity for malice." But beneath the formal assurances, there was something more personal, something that broke through the careful propriety he had maintained. "I find myself unable to occupy my days with the customary pursuits of my station. I ride the paths where last I saw you. I frequent the library where your preference for certain volumes had become evident. I have even taken the extraordinary step of attending a musical evening that I would ordinarily have declined, merely because your absence from society has rendered such gatherings unbearably hollow. I do not expect that you are aware of the manner in which your departure has restructured my existence. I merely wished you to understand that you are not the only soul engaged in transformation during this separation." 2 months into her exile, Mira wrote that the solicitor had completed his initial assessment. The case was stronger than expected. The documents were comprehensive. The Crown's interest was genuine. The timeline suggested that a formal hearing might commence within 4 months' time, perhaps 5, depending upon bureaucratic delays that were seemingly inevitable in matters of disputed succession. "And yet," she wrote, "I find myself hesitant regarding the outcome I have sought with such determination. What if the truth destroys not merely my family's reputation, but their very existence? What if I am the instrument of ruin for people I cannot help but love despite their sins? What if the woman I become through this process is someone even I cannot recognize or respect?" Alistair recognized in these words the voice of one arriving at the threshold of genuine transformation, not the sentimental crisis of the young, but the profound existential doubt of an adult soul confronting the magnitude of her own agency. He wrote, "The woman you become shall be one who chose integrity over comfort, truth over protection, and her own soul's salvation over the preservation of comfortable lies. These are not the qualities of a person to be feared. These are the qualities of someone I shall be honored to know." Spring arrived at Fenwick Manor with an insistence that seemed almost accusatory in its brightness. The gardens burst forth in a profusion of white hyacinth and purple crocus, and the air carried that particular quality of possibility that accompanies the season of renewal. Alistair found himself unable to find solace in the beauty. It served only as a reminder that time moved relentlessly forward, that the separation between himself and Mira was entering its 4th month, and that the hearing regarding the Solène succession was now only weeks away. He had received 3 more letters from her, each carrying news that was progressively more consequential. The Crown had indeed taken an interest in the matter, a serious interest. A royal commissioner had been appointed to investigate the claims she had brought forward. Documents had been examined by historians and legal scholars. The preliminary findings suggested that her father's claim to the earldom was indeed founded upon fraudulent documentation and the systematic destruction of evidence. What surprised Alistair most profoundly was the manner in which Mira seemed to be proceeding through this vindication with a spirit of sorrowful pragmatism rather than triumphant vindication. "I do not feel as I imagined I would feel upon discovering that my suspicions were accurate," she had written. "I anticipated a sensation of relief, perhaps even righteous satisfaction. Instead, I am overwhelmed by a grief so profound that I find myself unable to occupy entire days. My father, whatever his faults regarding honesty and integrity, was devoted to my welfare within the parameters of his understanding. My brother, who shall lose his title and his anticipated inheritance, is innocent of the original deception and yet shall be held accountable for its consequences. The servants who have served our family faithfully for decades will find themselves unemployed and bearing the stigma of association with scandal. I have become the destroyer of the life I knew. And while I believe that destruction to be necessary, I cannot persuade myself that it is just." The morning before the scheduled hearing in London, a courier arrived bearing a letter sealed with that same unfamiliar crest she had employed previously. Alistair's heart accelerated as he recognized her hand, but accelerated further still upon opening the letter and finding it to be remarkably brief. "Your Grace, I shall be in London tomorrow for the hearing before the Royal Commissioner. The outcome is no longer uncertain. The Crown has determined that my claim is valid and that the succession of the earldom shall be declared void. The estates shall be returned to Crown control, pending the Crown's determination of legitimate heirs. The title shall be stripped from my father's line. I write not to inform you of these matters, which you have doubtless already learned through official channels, but to ask a question of profound importance to my future. Would you permit me to call upon you at your London residence tomorrow evening, after the hearing concludes? There is something I must speak to you regarding that cannot be conveyed through correspondence. It is something that has troubled my conscience for the entirety of my exile, and which I believe requires confession made in person, face to face, with no barrier of parchment or formal courtesy between us. If my presence would be unwelcome or inappropriate, I shall understand and shall trouble you no further. But if you might find it possible to grant me this audience, I should be profoundly grateful." M.S. Alistair stood motionless in his study for a considerable duration, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. 4 months of separation, of carefully composed correspondence, of maintaining the proper distance that courtesy demanded, and in a single sentence she had dismantled it entirely. She was coming to London. She was coming to him. He spent the remainder of the day in a state of barely suppressed agitation. He departed for his London residence immediately, arriving by late afternoon and setting about ensuring that every detail of his household was immaculate. He selected his attire with unusual care, neither too formal nor insufficiently dignified, settling upon a waistcoat of dark grey silk beneath a coat of charcoal wool, restrained but exquisite. He instructed his staff that a guest would be received in the evening, and that the drawing-room should be prepared with particular attention to the arrangement of lamps and the drawing of curtains. He wanted the room to be warm without being theatrical, private without being improper. When she arrived the following evening, precisely at 8 o'clock, he was waiting in the hall. She wore a travelling dress of deep burgundy, and her hair, which had been elaborately arranged at their last meeting, was now simply styled, pulled back with a single ivory comb. She appeared simultaneously more tired and more beautiful than he remembered, as though the months of struggle had refined her down to something essential and luminous. "Miss Solène," he said, and his voice carried a steadiness that cost him considerable effort to maintain. "You have come." "I have come," she confirmed, and there was something in her eyes that suggested she had rehearsed this moment as extensively as he had, "and I find myself uncertain how to begin." He gestured toward the drawing-room, and she proceeded before him with that particular grace that had first caught his attention, the movement of someone who is conscious of being observed and yet unmoved by that consciousness. Once they were settled, he in one chair and she upon the settee at a respectful distance, he waited. He would not press her. Whatever she had come to say was clearly of significance and would require space to be spoken. "The hearing concluded precisely as anticipated," she began, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed upon some point beyond the room. "The Commissioner read into record all evidence supporting my claims. My father's fraud was documented extensively. The estates were declared forfeit. The title is suspended pending determination of legitimate succession." She paused, and her fingers tightened against each other. "And I found that I felt nothing but sorrow," she continued. "No triumph, no vindication, merely the profound knowledge that I had been correct, and that being correct had cost my family everything." Alistair remained silent, Recognizing that she had not yet arrived at the confession that had compelled her to seek this interview, he merely inclined his head slightly, indicating that she should continue. During these months of exile, Mira continued, and her voice had taken on a quality of trembling that belied her careful composure, I have had occasion to examine not merely the documents my aunt preserved, but my own heart, and I have discovered something that troubles me greatly. She finally looked at him directly, and he saw in her eyes a vulnerability so profound that it seemed to cost her everything to permit him to witness it. When I departed from Fenwick Manor, I told myself that my journey was undertaken solely in service of truth. I told myself that my actions were motivated by integrity and the necessity of exposing deception. And I believed this narrative entirely. I constructed it with such care and such conviction that I scarcely questioned it. She rose abruptly and moved to the window, drawing back the heavy curtain to gaze out into the London evening where carriages passed and gas lamps glowed in the darkness. But in the solitude of my exile, in the long hours before sleep, when the mind is less capable of sustaining its constructed narratives, I came to understand something far more complicated. I departed because I required distance from you. Alistair's breath seemed to lodge in his throat. Not because your company was disagreeable, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, but because your kindness, your evident regard, your manner of seeing me, truly seeing me, not as a member of a disgraced family, but as an individual possessed of agency and integrity, was undermining my resolve to construct an independent existence. She turned from the window, and her face was illuminated by the soft glow of the lamps, every feature rendered with singular clarity. I was terrified, she said, that if I remained in proximity to you, I would begin to seek validation from your approval, that your support, however freely offered, would become a substitute for my own self-reliance, that I would transform from a woman determined to discover truth into a woman merely grateful for protection, extended by a powerful man. Alistair found himself rising, though he made no movement toward her, maintaining the careful distance between them. I see, he said quietly. Do you? Mira asked, and there was a challenge in her voice now, a subtle edge that suggested she was asking far more than the simple question implied. Do you understand that I had to prove to myself, not to society, not to my family, not even to you, but to myself alone, that I possessed the courage to stand against deception, that I could endure isolation, uncertainty, even the threat of destruction from those I love, in service of integrity? I do understand, he said, and I respect profoundly the clarity with which you have identified the complexity of your own motivations. It is a quality rare in any person, and rarer still in women who have been taught to defer their own judgment to the opinions of those surrounding them. Mira's expression softened slightly. And yet, she said, I have also come to understand something equally troubling. In my determination to prove independence, I may have deprived myself of something equally essential. In my flight from the possibility of being defined by another's regard, I fled from genuine connection. She moved toward him, slowly, with the deliberation of one approaching a threshold of significant consequence. During these 4 months of separation, I have been compelled to acknowledge that my thoughts have returned to you, with a frequency that suggests your presence in my life is not merely a complication to be overcome, but a genuine necessity to my own wholeness. Alistair felt something within his carefully constructed restraint begin to fragment. I have come to London, Mira continued, not merely to confess the destruction of my family's fraud, but to confess something more personal. I have come because I required you to understand that the woman who departed from Fenwick Manor was not the same woman who stands before you now. And I required you to know that this transformation occurred not despite your absence, but profoundly because of it. Mira, he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, spoken without formality or qualification. It emerged as both question and declaration. The Crown's Commissioner informed me this afternoon, she said, her voice steady now despite the magnitude of what she was undertaking, that following the resolution of the succession matter, I shall have access to certain funds that my aunt placed in trust, funds that were specifically designated to grant me independence should my family circumstances become untenable. She paused, gathering herself for what she clearly recognized as the most significant confession of all. I am no longer without resources. I am no longer dependent upon the protection of anyone. I am, for the first time in my existence, entirely autonomous. And it is precisely because I have achieved this independence that I find myself able to acknowledge what I have attempted to conceal from myself throughout my exile. Alistair waited, scarcely breathing. I have come to London, Mira said, to tell you that the woman I have become, independent, resolved, capable of standing alone, has also come to recognize that standing alone is not the same as standing complete, that there is a difference between self-reliance and solitude, that the person I am becoming is someone who wishes to build a future, not from necessity or dependence, but from authentic choice. She extended her hand toward him, palm open, in a gesture of extraordinary vulnerability. And the choice I have made, Your Grace, is to ask if you would permit me to know you, not as my protector, but as my equal, not as the woman you once regarded with kindness, but as the woman I have become through struggle and solitude. Alistair's hand closed gently around hers, and the contact between them seemed to reverberate through the drawing room like the resonance of a struck bell. He drew her forward with deliberate care, as though any sudden movement might fracture the profound fragility of this moment. You ask a question that I have been formulating an answer to since the moment your carriage disappeared into the darkness of that rain-soaked evening, he said, his voice carrying a depth of emotion that propriety had previously constrained. You ask if I would know you as an equal, and the answer is this: I have always known you as an equal. What has changed is only your willingness to permit yourself to be known as such. Mira's eyes glistened with the promise of tears, though she maintained her composure with the discipline that had become characteristic of her. I fear, she said quietly, that I have constructed narratives regarding what you represent: stability, power, the capacity to protect, and I fear that these constructs may have obscured my vision of who you actually are, a man capable of solitude, a man willing to wait without conditions or expectations, a man whose regard is offered not as compensation for deficiency, but as recognition of equality. Then permit me to dispel that fear entirely, Alistair said. He released her hand, only to guide her to the settee, settling himself beside her with a proximity that was intimate without being improper. I am a man who has spent 4 decades constructing walls of duty and restraint, believing that such restraint was the highest form of honor. And in the space of a single evening, when you stood beside a carriage with the weight of truth upon your shoulders, I discovered that those walls were merely prisons of my own construction. He paused, choosing his words with the careful precision of one for whom emotion was not habitually given voice. Your departure did not diminish my regard for you. It clarified it. It transformed it from the vague appreciation a man might extend to a woman of beauty and grace into something far more fundamental. It became recognition. It became the understanding that some souls are kindred precisely because they have traveled through darkness and emerged still seeking light. Mira turned toward him fully, her earlier formality beginning to dissolve like morning mist beneath the warmth of acknowledged truth. I wrote to you extensively, she said, because writing permitted me to maintain the distance I believed necessary, but the distance became increasingly unbearable. With each letter, I found myself revealing more of my inner self than I had ever permitted anyone to perceive, and with each response from you I discovered that revelation was not met with judgment or condescension, but with genuine understanding. She drew a breath that seemed to encompass both courage and resignation. I have been afraid, she continued, of becoming the sort of woman who depends upon a man for validation, and yet I have also discovered that there is a difference between dependence and connection. That mutual regard does not constitute diminishment of self, but rather expansion of it. Then we are in agreement upon a matter of considerable significance, Alistair said, and there was something approaching tenderness in his expression, that the woman you are becoming is someone I wish to know, not to possess, not to direct, but to accompany, through whatever future circumstances we might construct together. He rose and moved to the window, gesturing for her to join him. She did so, and they stood side by side, looking out at the London evening where the city sprawled in its infinite complexity. During your exile, he said, I came to understand something about myself that I had previously avoided acknowledging. I had constructed my life around duty and obligation, believing that such structure was sufficient to constitute a life worthy of my station. But in your absence I recognized that all the duties and all the obligations bore an emptiness that no amount of propriety could disguise. He turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw reflected a vulnerability that matched her own. Your return, not as a woman in need of protection, but as a woman who has endured and emerged transformed, offers me something I had resigned myself to never possessing. It offers the possibility of genuine partnership, of a future constructed not from necessity, but from authentic choice. Mira reached for his hand, and this time the gesture was not tentative, but possessed of intention and deliberate commitment. "I must tell you," she said, "that the path forward is not without complications. My family name is diminished, the scandal will be considerable, society will whisper regarding my role in the destruction of the Solène reputation. Association with me will not enhance your standing, it may indeed complicate it." "Then let it complicate it," Alistair said with surprising vehemence. "I have spent decades securing and maintaining standing within society. I have discovered that standing, when it is built upon the preference of others rather than upon authentic conviction, is a fragile thing indeed. I would rather stand alongside you in diminished social regard than stand alone in the hollow respect of those who do not comprehend integrity." He raised her hand to his lips in a gesture that was simultaneously respectful and profoundly intimate. "I ask only one thing of you," he continued. "I ask that you remain cognizant of the distinction between the man I am and the protections I am capable of offering. I ask that you build your future with me, not because you require rescue, but because you choose the partnership we might construct together." Mira's composure finally surrendered to emotion, and a single tear traced its way down her cheek, not a tear of sorrow, but of profound relief at the absence of necessity to maintain her careful restraint. "I accept," she said simply. "Not the protection, but the partnership. Not the escape from difficulty, but the companionship through it." The drawing room was silent except for the distant sounds of London beyond the windows. In that silence, something fundamental shifted between them. Not the commencement of romance in the traditional sense, but the acknowledgement of a union that had been forming through correspondence and separation, through adversity and mutual growth, and that had finally arrived at the moment when both parties recognized it for what it was: genuine, enduring, and profoundly transformative. "I have waited," Alistair said softly, "since the moment you departed. I have waited through every day of your exile, through every letter, through every hour of uncertainty regarding whether you would return. And now that you are here, I find that the waiting has transformed into something far more significant. It has transformed into readiness." 3 weeks following Mira's return to London, the announcement appeared in the Times. Not a proclamation of immediate marriage, but a notice of betrothal, a formal statement that His Grace Alistair Fenwick, Duke of Argentford, had entered into an engagement with Miss Mira Solène, with the union to be solemnized within the coming months, pending certain social and familial arrangements. Society's response was precisely as Mira had anticipated, and as Alistair had endeavoured to prepare her for. The whispers commenced almost immediately. Speculation regarding the nature of their association became rampant. Some suggested that Alistair had been compromised into the engagement through some form of social manipulation on Mira's part. Others hinted at far less respectable explanations for the Duke's apparent infatuation with a woman whose family name was now synonymous with fraud and deception. But what surprised both Mira and Alistair was the manner in which certain segments of society chose to interpret the betrothal differently. There were those who perceived in Alistair's choice a form of nobility, the willingness of a man of the highest rank to overlook family disgrace in recognition of individual merit and integrity. There were others who found in Mira herself a certain romantic heroism, a woman who had sacrificed position and security in service of truth, and who had emerged not broken, but transformed. The Duchess Dowager, Alistair's mother, received the news with a composure that bordered on imperviousness. She had not risen from her country seat in Yorkshire in a decade, having adopted a stance of deliberate withdrawal from the complexities of contemporary society. Yet upon learning of her son's engagement, she dispatched a letter of remarkable brevity. "My dear Alistair, I have followed with interest the trajectory of Miss Solène's remarkable public exposure of her family's deception. I confess that I have never understood the manner in which so many of our contemporaries place the preservation of reputation above the pursuit of truth. You have always possessed this same peculiar conviction that integrity supersedes social convenience. I perceive in Miss Solène a kindred regard for honor over appearance. You will not find my opposition to this union. You may indeed find my support, should you require it in navigating the particular complexities that society will undoubtedly present. I shall travel to London for the wedding, should my health permit. It has been too long since I have found occasion to remind society that the values of the Fenwick line rest upon principles, rather than upon the convenience of conventional opinion. Your affectionate mother, Catherine. The letter was read aloud by Alistair in Mira's presence, and it occasioned in her a response of evident emotion, not because she feared the Duchess Dowager's disapproval, but because acceptance from his family represented a form of genuine integration that she had not permitted herself to anticipate. Your mother, Mira said quietly, is a woman of extraordinary clarity. She is, Alistair agreed, though I confess that her clarity has been developed over decades of observing the world from a deliberate distance. She has learned what I am only now beginning to comprehend, that society's opinion is a poor measure of actual worth, and that those individuals who are capable of maintaining integrity in the face of social disapprobation are precisely those worth knowing. In the weeks preceding the wedding, Mira found herself compelled to address certain practical matters that her altered circumstances had rendered urgent. Her brother, the former Viscount, whose title was now suspended pending Crown determination, had found himself in considerable financial difficulty. The estates were in Crown custody. The family properties were seized pending investigation. Her mother, who had been dependent upon the arrangement made within the family structure, had been left without clear means of support. It was Mira herself who proposed a solution to Alistair, one that demonstrated the complexity of her character and the manner in which she had transformed her newfound autonomy into genuine responsibility. "I should like," she said to him during an afternoon spent reviewing matters of joint financial planning, "to utilize a portion of the funds that my aunt placed in trust to establish my mother and brother with secure resources. They are innocent of my father's deceptions, yet they suffer the consequences as though they bore direct culpability." Alistair regarded her with evident approval. "It is a generous inclination, and one that reflects your character, but it is also unnecessary. I have already undertaken to secure appropriate positions for your brother within certain commercial enterprises, where his efforts might prove valuable. Your mother shall have a residence and income sufficient to her needs, provided through arrangements that will not appear to emanate directly from the family's reduced circumstances." "You have done this without consulting me?" Mira asked, and there was no accusation in her tone, merely clarification. "I have," he acknowledged, "and I recognize that in doing so, I have perhaps transgressed against the principle of equality we have established. But I submit that this action represents not my determination to control your circumstances, but rather my recognition that certain matters require resolution, and that your essential goodness would not permit you to enjoy our union while your family suffered want." Mira considered this, and then nodded slowly. "You understand me very well," she said finally, "perhaps too well in some instances. But I confess that I am grateful for your intervention. There exists a distinction between protecting someone from difficulty and ensuring that difficulty does not become unjust burden." The wedding was planned for June, in the small chapel adjacent to Fenwick Manor, the same location where 3 generations of dukes had been married, their vows witnessed by the assembled nobility and gentry of the county. The ceremony itself was to be marked by a restraint that was surprising given the social prominence of the participants, but which reflected the shared conviction of both bride and groom that the occasion was meant to signify commitment rather than spectacle. As spring advanced into early summer, Mira found herself experiencing a curious state of emotional equilibrium. She had achieved what she had set out to accomplish. She had exposed her family's deception. She had proven her own capacity for integrity in the face of enormous pressure, and she had emerged not destroyed, but transformed. And yet, in the achievement of these objectives, she had discovered that accomplishment was less significant than connection, that the satisfaction of individual integrity paled before the profound wholeness that came from genuine partnership with another soul, equally committed to truth and honor. The morning of the wedding dawned with a quality of crystalline perfection that seemed designed by Providence itself to bless the union. June sunlight streamed through windows at angles that rendered everything golden and luminous, and the gardens of Fenwick Manor displayed their fullest profusion of blooms, the air heavy with the scent of roses and lavender, with wisteria cascading from trellises in great purple torrents. Mira stood before the mirror in the chamber that had been prepared for her, attended by the Duchess Dowager herself, who had made the journey from Yorkshire and who had taken it upon herself to ensure that every detail of the bride's presentation reflected the significance of the occasion. The wedding dress was understated by the standards of the era, ivory silk without excessive ornamentation, but with such exquisite tailoring that the simplicity itself became the most eloquent form of statement. Her hair had been arranged with only a single strand of pearl woven through it, and she carried no flowers save a single white gardenia. "You are radiant," the Duchess Dowager said, and there was genuine warmth in her voice. She was a woman of perhaps 70 years, but possessed of the kind of bearing that rendered age insignificant. "My son is a fortunate man, though he is perceptive enough to recognize it." "I am nervous," Mira admitted, though her voice betrayed no tremor. "Not regarding the commitment itself, but regarding the magnitude of what I am about to accept. The position, the responsibility, the manner in which my actions will henceforth reflect, not merely upon myself, but upon the entire legacy of the Fenwicker name." "That," said the Duchess Dowager, "is precisely why you are suited to the position. A woman without anxiety regarding such matters would be unworthy of it. Alistair has spent his entire life under the burden of duty to his name and his station. What he requires, what he has discovered that he requires, is a partner who shares his conviction that duty is best discharged through integrity rather than through mere adherence to form." The chapel was filled beyond capacity with representatives of the county's most prominent families. There were those present who had come out of genuine respect for Alistair, and those who had come motivated by curiosity regarding the scandal-touched woman he had chosen to marry. There were murmurs and discreet observations, the sort of social commentary that always accompanied events of significance, but as Mira proceeded down the aisle on the arm of Alistair's nearest kinsman, her own father having declined to attend, something shifted in the assembled company. The murmurs ceased. The observers fell silent. There was something in the manner in which she moved, in the composure she displayed despite the enormity of her vulnerability, that rendered her genuinely commanding. Alistair stood at the altar in the formal dress of his position, black coat with silver threads, the ducal ribbon across his chest, his dark eyes fixed upon her approach with an intensity that made clear to every observer that this was not a marriage of convenience or social arrangement, but something far more profound. When she arrived at his side, he extended his hand, and she placed hers within it with a sense of rightness that seemed to encompass both of them. The ceremony proceeded with the traditional formality that marked such occasions, but the vows themselves carried an unusual quality, as though each word was being spoken not as obligatory recitation, but as genuine declaration. When the vicar asked if Alistair took Mira to be his wife, he responded not with the required "I do," but with a statement that drew sharp intakes of breath from the assembled guests. "I do," he said, "and I pledge to her not merely the protection of my name and station, but my absolute commitment to honoring the integrity and the independence that she has demonstrated, to walking beside her as an equal in all matters, and to ensuring that the woman she has become through trial and courage is never asked to diminish herself for the sake of social convenience." When the vicar turned to Mira and posed the identical question, she answered with equal clarity and unexpected elaboration. "I do," she said, "and I pledge to him my companionship, my respect, and my recognition that true partnership means accepting the strength of another without surrendering one's own. I pledge to build with him a life founded upon genuine choice rather than necessity, and to honor both his integrity and his capacity to wait with patience and dignity for truth to emerge." The pronouncement that followed, declaring them husband and wife, was met with applause that, while initially restrained, swelled into genuine enthusiasm, as the assembled company seemed to recognize that they had witnessed not merely a wedding, but something closer to a proclamation. As they proceeded from the chapel, Mira's hand resting within Alistair's arm, she became aware of the manner in which the assembled guests had begun to shift in their stance. Some who had come motivated by scandal-seeking curiosity now appeared to be genuinely moved. Others who had attended out of mere social obligation seemed to recognize that they had witnessed a demonstration of genuine principle, and that principle had a way of transforming even the most cynical observers. The reception that followed was held in the great hall of Fenwick Manor, where tables laden with food and drink had been arranged, and where the assembled company celebrated well into the evening. But what struck Mira most profoundly was the manner in which, as the evening progressed and the celebration continued, she found herself accepted not as a woman of diminished circumstance, but as the Duchess of Argentford, a position that, she was discovering, carried power and influence that extended far beyond the trappings of title. Late in the evening, as the celebration continued, Alistair drew her aside into a quieter chamber, his private study, lined with books and lit by a single substantial fire. "You have been magnificent," he said simply. "I have merely been myself," she replied, Precisely, he said, and that, my dear Duchess, is precisely what renders this entire proceeding so extraordinary. 1 year had passed since the wedding, and Alistair found himself observing his wife with the same intensity of attention that had characterized their entire association. She sat in the morning room of their London residence, correspondence spread across the writing table before her, her attention focused with the concentration that had become characteristic of her in the months since assuming her position as Duchess. The scandal that had surrounded her family's exposure had not dissipated entirely. Society's memory, while long, was eventually superseded by newer outrages and fresh sources of gossip, but what had emerged in its place was something far more significant. A recognition that Mira Fenwicker, Duchess of Argentford, was not a woman to be pitied or dismissed, but rather one whose counsel and influence were genuinely valued within certain circles of importance. She had become, quite unexpectedly, a patroness of considerable note. A charitable foundation established in her name provided support to women whose circumstances, whether through family misfortune, legal injustice, or simple societal indifference, had left them without resources or advocacy. She had recruited solicitors of repute to advise women regarding inheritance matters and disputed succession. She had begun quietly and with characteristically careful precision to establish a small library dedicated to the preservation of historical documents that might otherwise have been lost to deliberate destruction or simple negligence. "I have received a response from the archivist in Edinburgh," she said, looking up from one of her letters. "The documents regarding the Morland succession dispute have been located and verified. The woman at the centre of the dispute, Lady Margaret Morland, shall now have legal standing to pursue her claim, something that would have been impossible without access to these records." Alistair settled himself in the chair across from her, regarding her with evident satisfaction. "You have become quite formidable in your new position," he observed. "I have become quite clear regarding my purpose," Mira corrected gently. "There are countless women positioned precisely as I was, aware of injustice, capable of bearing testimony to truth, yet lacking either the resources or the social standing to make that testimony consequential. If my position permits me to serve as intermediary in such matters, then I have found the genuine utility of my station." She set down her pen and regarded him with the directness that had never wavered, even as their relationship had deepened and matured. "There is something more I must tell you," she continued, "something that I have been contemplating for some weeks, and which I believe requires your counsel and your agreement before I proceed." Alistair's expression shifted to one of attentive concern. "You possess my full attention. Speak freely." "I have been approached by the family of one of my early beneficiaries," Mira said, "a young woman whose inheritance was disputed through deliberate falsification of documents. The family has asked if I would consider writing a brief account of my own experience, not as an exposure of scandal, but as a testament to the manner in which determined effort can expose truth regardless of social pressure or familial intimidation." She paused, allowing the significance of her request to settle between them. They envisioned this account being made available discreetly to women in similar circumstances, a demonstration that such situations can be confronted and resolved. They have suggested that it might provide hope to those who otherwise believe their circumstances to be irredeemable. "And what is your inclination?" Alistair asked carefully. "My inclination is to proceed," Mira said, "but the account would necessarily contain references to your intervention on my behalf, to the manner in which you extended resources and support, to the consequences my family endured as a result of truth-telling. I do not wish to expose you to additional scrutiny or criticism by association with such a text." Alistair rose and moved to her side, taking her hand and drawing her to her feet. "You misunderstand my position," he said. "I have no interest in shielding myself from association with truth-telling or with the consequences that truth-telling engenders. Quite the contrary. I would be honored to be named as a participant in your journey toward integrity. Let the text be written. Let it be distributed. Let it serve as testimony that there are men within society who recognize that supporting a woman's pursuit of truth is not a diminishment, but an elevation of our collective honor." Over the following months, Mira devoted herself to the composition of the account, not a full narrative of events, but rather a focused meditation on the process of exposing deception, the costs of integrity, and the manner in which solitude can become the crucible within which genuine selfhood is forged. She wrote with honesty and without sentimentality, avoiding the melodramatic embellishments that characterized much popular writing of the era, instead offering a clear-eyed assessment of difficulty and its relationship to growth. When the account was completed and distributed through carefully selected channels, its impact was considerable. Letters began arriving from women throughout England, some who had been emboldened to pursue their own struggles toward truth, others who sought specific counsel regarding legal matters they faced, still others who simply wished to express their gratitude for evidence that their circumstances were not unique or insurmountable. Mira responded to each letter personally. She began to build an informal network of women engaged in similar struggles, not through public organizations that would have drawn scandal, but through private correspondence and carefully arranged consultations. She became, without formal title or official position, something approaching an advocate for women, whose voices were otherwise silenced by circumstance or propriety. And throughout this transformation, Alistair observed with quiet satisfaction. He had discovered that his greatest joy lay not in the exercise of his ducal authority or the maintenance of his family's position, but rather in bearing witness to the full flourishing of the woman he had chosen to partner with in life. He had learned, through her example, that true power resided not in the domination of circumstance, but in the courageous acceptance of truth and the willingness to bear its consequences. One evening, as they sat together in their private chambers at Fenwick Manor, having returned to the country estate as the London season concluded, Mira reached for his hand and held it in a gesture of profound tenderness. "I could not have undertaken any of this without you," she said quietly, "not because I required your protection, but because I required your absolute conviction that the woman I was becoming was worth becoming. Your faith in my capacity sustained me through the most difficult passages. Your own faith in yourself accomplished it," Alistair replied. "I merely provided the space within which that faith could flourish, and in providing that space, I discovered that I was providing something equally essential to myself, the opportunity to become the man I had always aspired to be, but lacked the courage to become without your example." The letter arrived in autumn, when the leaves were beginning their transformation toward gold and crimson, and the air carried that particular quality of poignancy that accompanied the turning of seasons. It bore the seal of the crown, and within it contained notification that the matter of the Solène succession had been formally resolved. The findings were precisely as Mira had anticipated. Her father's claim to the earldom was declared void, the title suspended indefinitely pending determination of legitimate heirs from earlier generations. The estates were to be distributed according to Crown determination, with a portion of the holdings offered to Mira herself, not as restoration of family honor, but as compensation for the material loss she had sustained through her own actions in exposing the deception. But there was something more significant contained within the Crown's communication. The Royal Commissioner had noted, in formal language, that the manner in which Miss Mira Solène, now the Duchess of Argentford, had conducted herself throughout the proceedings represented a remarkable demonstration of integrity and courage in the face of familial pressure and social opprobrium. The Commissioner had further recommended that her efforts on behalf of justice and truth be recognized through inclusion in the next honours list, should she and her husband deem such recognition appropriate. Alistair read the letter aloud to Mira in the quiet of his study, and when he had finished, he set it carefully upon the desk between them. "You have been offered recognition," he said simply. "What is your inclination?" Mira regarded the letter for a long moment before responding. "I accept the recognition," she said finally, "not for the honor it confers upon me, but for the manner in which it might serve to validate the experiences of those women I have sought to support. If my name is associated with honors granted for truth-telling and courage, it may inspire others to pursue similar paths." The notification of the honor was announced the following spring, and while it occasioned considerable comment in society, a woman honored not for family legacy or marriage to a man of position, but for her own demonstrated character and actions, it was received with general approbation. Certain factions of society that had previously viewed her with suspicion or disdain found themselves compelled to recalibrate their assessment. But more significantly, the honor served as validation for the network of women that Mira had been quietly building. Letters began arriving from across the kingdom, from women who had read of her recognition and who felt emboldened to reach out, to seek counsel, to pursue their own struggles toward truth and justice. By the autumn of the second year following her marriage, Mira had become something approaching a figure of genuine cultural significance. not because society had deemed her so, but because women themselves had recognized in her a model of what was possible when integrity superseded social convenience and when courage was sustained through genuine partnership. Alistair, observing this transformation with the satisfaction of a man who had learned to value outcome over appearance, found himself increasingly drawn into his wife's work. He began to utilize his considerable legal and financial resources in service of the causes she championed. He employed his ducal influence to ensure that certain solicitors of progressive conviction gained access to cases that would have otherwise been closed to them. He provided funding for the preservation of historical documents that might otherwise have been lost, and through it all, the connection between them deepened in ways that transcended romance and entered the realm of genuine spiritual partnership. They had begun not as lovers, but as two souls recognizing in each other a commitment to truth that superseded all other considerations. Through time and experience, that recognition had transformed into something far more profound, a union based not upon passion or attraction, though those elements were certainly present, but upon the shared conviction that life was most authentically lived when integrity was placed above all other considerations. One evening, as they stood together on the terrace of Fenwick Manor, overlooking the gardens where they had first truly spoken to each other, Mira turned to Alistair with an expression of profound contentment. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the woman I was when I departed in that carriage. She was afraid, uncertain, burdened by secrets she did not create, but could not escape. She believed that truth required solitude to be pursued, and that integrity demanded isolation as the price of its achievement." She paused, her gaze fixed upon the horizon where the setting sun was painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. "I have come to understand," she continued, "that truth does require courage and sometimes solitude, but that the deepest truths are those we discover in genuine connection with another soul. That integrity is not diminished by partnership, but rather amplified by it. That the woman I have become is not someone who has escaped her circumstances, but someone who has integrated them, transformed them into the foundation upon which something more enduring has been constructed." Alistair took her hand, and together they remained silent, watching as the light shifted and transformed the familiar landscape into something subtly different, yet recognizable, much as both of them had been transformed through their union, yet remained fundamentally themselves. "I waited," he said finally, "as I promised I would, and in that waiting, I discovered that the person I became through waiting was more fully myself than I had ever been before. You have given me that gift, the gift of becoming." 10 years later, the manor house stood bathed in autumn sunlight, its stones mellowed by the passage of years into a warm honey gold that seemed to absorb and radiate warmth. The gardens had been transformed under Mira's deliberate cultivation into something approaching a living testament to her evolution, no longer the formal arrangements dictated by tradition, but rather gardens that reflected her own philosophy, beauty that emerged from purposeful growth, from the integration of wild and cultivated elements, from the understanding that true elegance arose when discipline and spontaneity were held in balance. Alistair stood at the edge of the terrace, watching as his wife moved through the garden with the grace that had never diminished despite the passage of a decade. She was no longer the anxious young woman who had departed in darkness, nor the determined exile pursuing truth in solitude. She had become something altogether more substantial, a woman of genuine authority, whose quiet certainty commanded respect, and whose integrity had become woven so thoroughly into the fabric of her being that it was inseparable from her very presence. Behind them, in the great hall of Fenwick Manor, a gathering was assembling, an assembly of individuals who represented the culmination of the work that Mira had undertaken across the preceding 10 years. There were solicitors of repute, women whose lives had been transformed through access to legal advocacy and financial support, historians and archivists who had become custodians of records that might otherwise have been destroyed, and representatives from the organizations that had emerged from the seed that Mira had planted in her own small way. Today was the occasion of the formal establishment of what had come to be called the Fenwick Foundation for the Advancement of Truth and Justice, a legacy institution dedicated to providing resources and advocacy to those engaged in exposing historical deception and supporting women whose circumstances demanded courage and integrity. What had begun as Mira's personal mission had grown into something of genuine cultural significance, something that would endure beyond her own lifetime and continue the work of illuminating truth and supporting those willing to bear its consequences. "Are you prepared for this?" Alistair asked, moving to stand beside her. He had learned across the decade of their partnership to recognize when his wife was gathering herself for significant undertaking. The particular quietness that preceded her most important pronouncements, the stillness that suggested she was drawing strength from some deep inner wellspring. "I am," she said simply, though I confess to a lingering sense of astonishment that the small seed I planted in solitude has grown into something so substantial. When I departed in that carriage, I could not have imagined that my search for truth would ultimately manifest in an institution bearing our name, devoted to the very principles that guided my journey. She turned to face him fully, and he saw in her eyes the same luminosity that had first captured his attention a decade ago, but deepened now, refined by experience, carrying within it the weight of genuine wisdom. "Do you recall," she asked, "what you told me on the evening before I departed? You said that you would wait for my return, that you would wait a lifetime if necessary." "I do recall it," Alistair said, "though I am uncertain whether my statement was born of prescience or merely of the desperation of one who recognizes that he has encountered something irreplaceable and fears its loss." "Perhaps it was both," Mira said. "But what I wish to acknowledge is this. The waiting was not the most significant gift you offered me. The most significant gift was your absolute conviction that the woman I was becoming was worth becoming, that my pursuit of truth, however costly, however destructive to family and circumstance, was something to be honored rather than prevented." She took both his hands in her own, and the gesture carried within it a renewal of the vows they had made a decade earlier. "I have spent these 10 years discovering that integrity is not a solitary pursuit. That truth is best served when it is championed by multiple voices, supported by genuine resources, and pursued with the understanding that transformation is both individual and collective. You have been the foundation upon which all of this has been possible, not through restraint or control, but through your absolute commitment to honoring the autonomy and authenticity of the woman I have chosen to become." Inside the great hall, the assembly was growing larger. There were faces Mira recognized, women whose lives had been transformed through the work of the foundation, whose inheritance disputes had been resolved, whose family secrets had been brought to light and addressed. There were faces she did not recognize, individuals who had heard of the Foundation's work and had come to bear witness to its establishment, to contribute their own experience and expertise to something larger than themselves. But what struck Mira most profoundly as she moved through the gathering, greeting individuals and accepting their congratulations, was the recognition of a fundamental truth. The path that had begun in darkness and solitude had ultimately led to something luminous and collective. Her courageous choice to pursue truth had not remained her private triumph, but had become a catalyst for transformation in others. As the formal ceremonies commenced, the reading of the Foundation's charter, the acknowledgement of the solicitors and historians who would serve as its primary officers, the presentation of the first awards for individuals who had contributed to the work of truth-telling, Mira found herself reflecting upon the curious alchemy through which personal struggle had been transformed into collective purpose. She thought of the ampule, the hourglass that had measured her journey, that had traveled with her into exile and had witnessed the turning points of her transformation. It rested now in a case of polished oak in her private chambers, no longer inverted to measure time passing, but preserved as a testament to a season of her life when time had seemed her greatest enemy, and when distance from all that was familiar had appeared to be the only path toward authenticity. But she had come to understand that the ampule's true significance was not the time it had measured, but rather the manner in which it had symbolized the essential truth of human experience. All things transform, all circumstances change, and the self that emerges from crucible of difficulty is often more fully realized, more authentically human than the self that preceded it. As evening fell and the gathering continued into celebration, Alistair found his wife standing once again at the edge of the terrace, looking out across gardens that held within them the accumulated wisdom of a decade's growth and intentional cultivation. "I was thinking," Mira said as he approached, "about the girl who departed from this place 10 years ago. She was brave, certainly, but also afraid. She believed that truth required solitude, that integrity demanded isolation, that becoming oneself meant standing apart from all human connection." She reached for his hand, and he clasped it with the same tenderness that had characterized every gesture between them across the decade. I have learned, she continued, that the deepest truths are those we discover in genuine partnership with another soul. That integrity is most powerfully expressed not in solitary conviction, but in the willingness to stand beside another person, to build something together, to acknowledge that our individual transformation is inextricably bound to our collective growth. Alistair drew her close, and together they stood in the gathering darkness, watching as the first stars appeared above the manor, tiny points of light emerging in the vast expanse of sky, each one unique, distinct, and yet part of something infinitely larger than itself. I waited, he said softly, echoing the words he had spoken a decade earlier, because I understood that some souls are worth waiting for, that some love is worth the sacrifice of comfortable solitude, and that the person one becomes through the act of waiting is often infinitely more fully realized than the person who had never attempted it. Mira turned to face him, and in the starlight her face held that same luminosity that had captured his heart years ago, but now accompanied by the wisdom of genuine experience, the peace of hard-won understanding, and the profound gratitude of one who has learned that the greatest transformation comes not through escape from difficulty, but through the courageous integration of it. Then let us continue waiting, she said, for whatever the future holds, for the transformation continues. The work deepens, and the woman I am becoming will always require the partnership of the man you have been kind enough to become alongside me. And in that moment, beneath the infinite expanse of stars, the Duke and Duchess of Argenford stood together, two souls who had learned that true love is not the absence of struggle, but the presence of genuine partnership through all struggles, that integrity is best championed not in isolation, but in authentic connection with another, and that the deepest fulfillment comes not from achieving what we sought, but from becoming who we needed to become in the pursuit of it. A reflection on truth, courage, and authentic partnership. In this tale of Mira and Alistair, we are presented with a profound meditation on what it means to live with integrity in a world that often rewards comfortable deception. The moral that emerges from their journey is not a simple lesson, but rather a complex recognition of fundamental truths about human transformation and the nature of genuine love. The first and most evident moral is this: truth, however costly, is ultimately more liberating than the most comfortable lies. Mira's decision to expose her family's deception did not emerge from a desire for vengeance or righteousness, but from a profound recognition that she could not fully inhabit her own soul while remaining complicit in systematic falsehood. She understood, perhaps before she could articulate it, that authentic personhood is impossible when built upon foundations of deception. The cost of truth was considerable: the destruction of her family's reputation, the loss of the social position she had known, the isolation that characterized her exile. Yet what she gained was something infinitely more valuable: the capacity to stand fully in her own truth, to know herself as fundamentally aligned with her own convictions. But perhaps the deeper moral emerges from the manner in which Mira and Alistair relate to one another. True love is not the possession or control of another person, but rather the creation of space within which that person can fully become themselves. Alistair does not attempt to restrain Mira's pursuit of truth, nor does he offer her protection that would compromise her autonomy. Instead, he honors her journey. He supports her through resources and advocacy, but he refuses to substitute his protection for her own agency. This is the highest form of love, not the romantic gesture that diminishes the beloved through possession, but the courageous choice to stand alongside another as they undertake their own transformation. There is also an essential moral regarding the relationship between solitude and connection. We do not become fully ourselves in isolation, but rather through the integration of our personal journey with genuine partnership. Mira's exile in pursuit of truth was necessary. She required distance from the comfortable deceptions of society and family in order to hear the voice of her own conscience. Yet the transformation that began in solitude was completed only when she returned to genuine connection. The woman who emerged from exile was not simply the isolated truth seeker, but someone who had learned to integrate personal integrity with the capacity for authentic relationship. Similarly, Alistair's transformation occurred not in the solitary exercise of his ducal authority, but through his willingness to be changed by his connection with Mira, to become someone more fully human through the act of honoring another's autonomy. The story suggests as well a profound truth about the nature of waiting. The act of waiting, when it is not passive resignation but active faith in another's journey, is itself a form of love that transforms both the one who waits and the one awaited. Alistair's promise to wait for Mira is not a constraining force but a liberation. His refusal to demand her immediate return, his acceptance that she must complete her journey in solitude, his faith that she will return transformed, these are expressions of love more profound than any romantic gesture could be, and in the act of waiting, he discovers that he too is being transformed, that he is becoming more fully himself through the discipline of honoring another's autonomy. Perhaps most significantly, the moral of this story speaks to the relationship between personal transformation and collective purpose. Our individual struggles toward integrity, when pursued with courage, inevitably become catalysts for transformation in others. Mira's personal journey, her courageous exposure of her family's deception, her solitary pursuit of truth, does not remain her private accomplishment. Through her determination and her subsequent work, countless other women are empowered to pursue their own struggles toward justice and truth. The foundation that emerges from her personal struggle becomes a living testament to the understanding that individual integrity, when expressed in service of collective good, creates something infinitely more significant than personal vindication. And finally, there is a moral embedded in the very structure of their romance. The most profound love is not that which sweeps us away from ourselves, but that which calls us toward our truest selves. Alistair does not offer Mira escape from difficulty or the comfort of being possessed. He offers her something far more valuable: recognition of her worth as an autonomous being, support for her integrity, and the space within which she can fully become who she is meant to be. And Mira, in return, offers Alistair the gift of being seen, of being recognized not as the Duke with all his power and position, but as a man capable of transformation, capable of growth, capable of becoming more fully human through his willingness to honor another's authenticity. These are the moral threads that weave through this tale. That truth, however costly, is liberating, that love is fundamentally about creating space for the beloved's autonomy, that we become ourselves through the integration of solitude and connection, that waiting can be an active expression of faith, that personal transformation inevitably catalyzes transformation in others, and that the deepest love calls us not away from ourselves, but toward our most authentic becoming. In a world that often privileges comfort over truth, possession over partnership, and the appearance of success over the substance of character, this story offers a gentle reminder that the most genuine fulfillment comes not from achieving what society tells us we should want, but from becoming who our deepest selves know we are meant to be, and from finding along the way another soul courageous enough to honor that journey. Dear beloved listeners, if this story has moved your heart, if the journey of Mira and Alistair has resonated with truths you recognize within your own experience, we invite you to become part of our community of truth seekers and lovers of authentic romance. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you receive each new story of Victorian romance, tales of courage, integrity, and transformative love that celebrate the depth and complexity of the human heart. Leave a comment below and share with us what aspect of Mira's journey spoke to you most deeply. Do you believe, as Alistair did, that waiting can be an expression of love? Have you experienced a moment in your own life when pursuing truth cost you comfort, but gifted you authenticity? Your reflections matter, and we would be honored to hear them. Share this story with someone you believe might benefit from its message, someone who is struggling with the tension between comfort and integrity, or who is learning what it means to love another person with genuine respect for their autonomy. The world needs more stories that celebrate the courage required to pursue truth, the depth of love that honors another's journey, and the understanding that our personal transformations inevitably become gifts to those around us. Your engagement with this channel helps us continue bringing these essential stories to audiences who hunger for narratives that feed the soul as well as entertain the senses. We thank you for your time, your attention, and your willingness to journey with us through the estates and hearts of the Victorian era. Your presence in our community transforms the solitary act of storytelling into something collective and meaningful. With profound gratitude and continued commitment to stories that matter, the Victorian Romance Audio Stories team